The story begins over 2,000 years ago with the architecture of Greece and, later, Rome. The ancient Greeks had first built their temples with wood and, influenced by the Egyptians and Mycenaeans, slowly developed a codified way of building. Classical architecture. What defined classical architecture? Many things, but the most important are round arches, symmetry, extremely specific rules about proportion, and the famous classical orders. 5 kinds of column with their own rules for size and decoration. From Greece it spread to Rome. But the Roman Empire fell, the Middle Ages arrived, and classical architecture faded. In its place, Gothic architecture eventually emerged, a style fundamentally at odds with that of Greece and Rome. Pointed arches, asymmetry, no strict proportion, and no rules about decoration. Until, in 15th century Italy, scholars started paying more attention to Roman ruins. Architects such as Filippo Brunelleschi, one of his buildings below, studied those ruins carefully, learned the rules of classical design, and revived them. The Renaissance had begun. This whole process was aided by the repopularization of the Roman architect Vitruvius, who lived in the 1st century BC. His book explaining everything about classical architecture is the only surviving architectural treatise from antiquity. Scholars like Leon Battista Alberti, after reading Vitruvius, then wrote their own books about classical architecture, which were widely published. They codified the orders, proportions, and decorative features, and then, crucially, they started applying them in new ways. Take the Palazzo della Consiglieria in Rome, started in 1489. Even though it uses their rules on proportion and decoration, it isn't something the Romans would necessarily have built themselves. So Renaissance architecture was general, small, and neoclassical. By the 17th century, a new form of neoclassical architecture had appeared, the Baroque. Baroque still operated on classical ideas, but it played with those rules and was far more exuberant and ornamented than the old Renaissance interpretation, a wild and intense style. Eventually, it morphed into Rococo. This was an even more refined neoclassicism, moving ever further away from the original architecture of Greece and Rome. Like the Hôtel de Soubise in Paris, its interior is from the 1740s. Rococo was luxurious, flamboyant, and theatrical. But things changed in the late 18th century. People started paying more attention to Greek architecture in particular, which was simpler and more restrained than Roman design. Compare Baroque and Rococo with the Parthenon in Athens, an original Greek temple, worlds apart. So, after the extravagance of Baroque and Rococo, it was time for something serious. Capital and neoclassical architecture was born. Now architects were designing buildings which the Greeks or Romans might have built themselves. Like La Madeleine in Paris, started in 1807. This neoclassical architecture was more austere and monumental, less ornamented and complex. It wasn't always an exact copy of classical design, but you can see how something like the British Museum, from the 1830s, is much closer to original Greek architecture. And so this was called the Greek Revival, in some sense the most faithful form of neoclassical architecture. All across the world, though mainly in Europe, buildings of the sort that had not been seen for nearly 2,000 years started going up. Neoclassicism at its peak. Still, neoclassicism was a global movement, and it took on different forms around the world. In the USA, the Founding Fathers adopted a pure neoclassicism to match their political admiration for the Romans and Greeks. The Rotunda in Virginia was based on the Panthéon in Rome. Then there's the US Capitol. With that colossal dome, it's clearly an interpretation of classical architecture rather than a straightforward imitation. But compare it to Baroque or Rococo, and you can see that it is far more faithful to original Greco-Roman architecture. In Britain, meanwhile, there was a movement known as Palladianism. It was named after the Renaissance architect Andrea Palladio and inspired by his harmonious interpretation of classical architecture. Chiswick House, built in 1729, is the ultimate Neo-Palladian building. Georgian architecture was also part of this broader neoclassical movement, not so much because it directly imitated Greco-Roman architecture, but because it cleaved closely to principles of symmetry, simplicity, and proportion. The Royal Crescent in Bath is a famous example. Neoclassicism in France reached its zenith during the reign of Napoleon, who cast himself as the successor to the Roman emperors. This was the almost intimidating empire style, epitomized by the Arc de Triomphe, a clear callback to the triumphal arches of ancient Rome. Then there's the Beaux Arts style, which saw the return of some Baroque tendencies. Pure neoclassicism was beginning to fade. And by the second half of the 19th century, in many places, it had gone altogether. Just look at the Palais Garnier in Paris from 1875. So capital N neoclassical architecture was waning, though neoclassical architecture in its broad sense was not. Buildings continued to be designed according to the general principles of Greece and Rome well into the 20th century, like the Treasury Building in London from 1917. In any case, though there were different kinds of neoclassical architecture, what united them was a tendency towards simplicity and the taking of direct inspiration from surviving ancient buildings. Like the Mosta Rotunda in Malta from 1873, again based on the Panthéon. So Renaissance, Baroque, Rococo, and Georgian are all neoclassical because they were inspired by and used the rules and motifs of Greek and Roman architecture. But true neoclassical architecture, by comparison, was faithful to what the Greeks and Romans actually built themselves. It's important not to get caught up with styles. Differences are inevitably blurred, and architecture has always been about more than mere rules. But hopefully, this has helped to explain the curious difference between neoclassical and neoclassical architecture.